To understand the transformation in Ethan Blackwell's life, you first need to know the man he was. In mid-2024, at the age of 42, Ethan was the epitome of American success. The CEO of a giant investment firm in New York, he ran a financial empire from a glass and steel skyscraper that pierced the clouds of Manhattan. His life was a precise mathematical equation, composed of stock charts, boardroom meetings, and private jet trips. His 8-figure fortune afforded him luxuries most people only see in movies: a minimalist apartment overlooking Central Park, a wardrobe of suits that cost more than luxury cars, and an expensive silence, bought and maintained with an almost surgical emotional detachment. He was a man who built his world on the cold logic of numbers, believing that any problem could be solved with the right strategy and resources. To him, emotions were unpredictable variables, glitches in the system that needed to be contained and managed, never felt to their fullest. This control, which made him a shark in the business world, turned him into a complete stranger in his own home. Ethan's greatest challenge lay not in the fluctuations of the stock market, but in the silence that filled his luxurious apartment. That silence had a name: Noah. His 7-year-old son, a wide-eyed, curious boy who had been born into a world without sound. Noah was deaf, a fact that Ethan treated as just another problem to be solved. Since his wife died 3 years earlier from a sudden and devastating illness, Ethan had seen himself as the sole guardian of a world he did not understand. He approached the task with the same mindset he used to close a deal. He hired the best therapists, the most renowned American Sign Language, ASL instructors, and purchased the latest in hearing aids, which did little to help Noah's condition. He sat in ASL class, his big fingers, used to signing million-dollar checks, fumbling with gestures that were supposed to mean "Dad" or "I love you," but that to him seemed like empty, mechanical movements. He could see the effort in his son's eyes, but the connection was like a dead phone line. There was a desire to communicate, but the message never reached its destination. The father-son relationship was a mirror of Ethan's soul, cold, functional, and marked by palpable frustration. Noah, with the innocent resilience of children, tried. He brought his father drawings, pointed at things with a twinkle in his eye, waiting for a response that went beyond a calculated nod or a forced smile. Ethan, in turn, saw each interaction as a test that he constantly failed. He didn't know how to fill the void left by his wife, the only one who could navigate Noah's world with a natural and loving fluidity. Now, without her, the apartment felt like a silent museum, and their communication was reduced to a scheduled routine: therapy, special school, dinner. Ethan's dream, though he hardly dared admit it to himself, was both simple and devastatingly complex: to hear his son laugh. Not the physical sound, which he knew was impossible, but the laughter of the soul, the genuine joy he saw in other children at the park, a joy that seemed like a foreign language to his own family. That desire was his greatest vulnerability, the only chink in his armor of control and power. And it was on a spring morning, the kind that paints the city with vibrant colors and the promise of renewal, that Ethan Blackwell's meticulously calculated world began to unravel. He had taken Noah to the park, a weekend indulgence he did more out of a sense of obligation than pleasure. While Noah played on a swing, Ethan allowed himself a moment of distraction. He answered an urgent work call, his low, authoritative voice a contrast to the laughter of the children around him. It had only been a few minutes, maybe 5, maybe 7. But in a father's world, 7 minutes can contain an eternity of panic. When he hung up the phone and looked up, the swing was empty. Ethan's heart, an organ he treated with the same indifference as an engine part, gave a violent jerk, as if it had been ripped from his chest. Panic rose in his throat, cold and metallic. His son's name stuck on his lips, a useless scream in a world Noah couldn't hear. Despair gripped Ethan with a primal ferocity he had never experienced before. All his wealth, all his power, evaporated in an instant, leaving him like any other terrified father. He ran through the park, his expensive suit wrinkled, his face pale. His eyes scanned every corner, every bush, every group of children, as his mind played out the worst-case scenarios. Noah's vulnerability had never felt so overwhelming. A small boy in a giant city, unable to cry out for help, unable to hear his name being called. Guilt hit him like a fist. How could he have been distracted? How could he have put a work call above the safety of his own son? Every second that passed was torture, a reminder of his monumental failure. And then, Just as the panic was about to consume him completely, he saw it. The scene was so improbable, so surreal, that for a moment, Ethan thought he was hallucinating. There was Noah, sitting on the soft grass, in the shade of an ancient, imposing tree whose branches looked like protective arms. And he wasn't alone. Across from him, sitting cross-legged, was a little girl. She was dirty, her feet bare and stained with dirt, her hair matted, and her clothes threadbare. Clearly a homeless child, the kind of person Ethan's world pretended didn't exist. But what shocked Ethan to his core wasn't what the girl looked like. It was what she was doing. Her tiny hands moved with astonishing speed and fluidity, forming complex, lifelike signs. And Noah, his silent, withdrawn son, responded with the same eloquence. He was smiling. Not a shy, forced smile, but a full, pure laugh that lit up his entire face. It was the laughter of the soul that Ethan had longed to see. He was witnessing his son have a real conversation, a genuine connection, with a complete stranger. Ethan approached slowly, feeling like an intruder in a sacred moment. The sound of his expensive shoes on the grass didn't interrupt the pair. They were in their own universe, a world of silent communication that was more vibrant than any conversation Ethan had ever had. He stopped a few feet away, his heart still pounding, but now for a different reason. It was a mixture of relief, amazement, and a twinge of something he would only later identify as envy. The girl, who couldn't have been more than 8, had a liveliness in her eyes that belied her appearance. There was a wisdom there, a maturity that belied her age. She gestured at a squirrel climbing a tree, and Noah responded excitedly, his fingers telling a story about a neighbor's dog. Ethan, the master of corporate communications, was taking a class in what it meant to truly connect with another human being. Finally, the girl sensed his presence. Her eyes, a surprisingly light brown, locked with Ethan's. There was no fear in them, only wary curiosity. She stopped gesturing, and Noah, following her gaze, turned to see his father. The smile on his face faltered, replaced by the familiar expression of distance. The magical moment had been broken. Ethan felt a pang of pain at this change. He forced himself to smile, a gesture that felt awkward and false. "Noah," he said, and then remembered the uselessness of the word and made the clumsy sign for son. The girl watched the gesture carefully, one eyebrow slightly arched. It was she who broke the silence. Her voice was a little hoarse, as if it had not been used often, but it was clear. "Is he your son?" she asked. Ethan just nodded, still processing the scene. "He's a good conversationalist," she added, and then gave Noah a quick sign that made him smile again. Puzzled and completely out of his element, Ethan crouched down to their level. How did you learn to talk like that?" he asked the girl, the question coming out more like a whisper. He was genuinely curious. Her fluency was natural, so different from his own robotic attempt. The girl looked down at her hands, a trace of melancholy crossing her face. "My mother taught me," she said. She was deaf, like him. The simplicity of her answer struck him. It wasn't expensive lessons or renowned therapists. It was love. It was a daughter's need to communicate with her mother. "Where is your a mother now?" Ethan asked, already dreading the answer. The girl swallowed hard, and for the first time, her bright eyes seemed to fill with tears. "She's in heaven. She got sick a few months ago." Ethan's world took another turn. This little being before him, dirty and barefoot, was not just a street kid, was an orphan who carried her mother's legacy in her hands. The girl, whose name he would later learn was Lily, explained her situation with the brutal honesty that only children possess. After her mother's death, she had been taken into the care of her grandmother, Catherine. But her grandmother was ill, with her memory coming and going, as Lily described dementia with heartbreaking simplicity. They lived together, alone. The revelation fell on Ethan like an anvil. The connection between Noah and Lily, the pure joy he had witnessed, was no mere chance encounter in the park. It was the meeting of two souls who understood silence in different ways. Noah, surrounded by luxury, but isolated by his condition. Lily, bereft of everything but holding the key to Noah's world. Ethan looked at his son, who was now holding Lily's hand, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and felt the armor around his heart crack a little more. Ethan's initial skepticism, his usual coolness, began to melt under the heat of this scene. He, who had always seen himself as the provider, the problem solver, was faced with a situation that his money could not fix, and his logic could not. decipher. The bond between these two children was something organic, something that he, with all his resources, had never been able to cultivate. It was a silent language of acceptance and mutual understanding. Seeing his son so happy, so complete, in the presence of this little stranger, was a blow to his pride and a balm to his father's soul. When Lily mentioned that she needed to go back to take care of her grandmother, an unusual impulse took hold of Ethan. "Wait," he said. "Have you guys had lunch yet?" The question hung in the air, strange even to his own ears. He never invited anyone to anything spontaneously. Lily stared at him, her eyes assessing him with a seriousness that belied her age. "Not yet," she replied, her voice low. There was a distinct hesitation in her posture. She was not a child who easily trusted strangers, especially men in suits who looked like they belonged on another planet. "I'd like to take you guys to lunch," Ethan offered, gesturing toward her, "and Noah, we can go somewhere nearby." Noah, understanding the proposal through his father's gestures, looked at Lily with bright anticipation in his eyes. He made the sign for "please," a gesture he rarely used with his father. His son's silent request was what sealed Ethan's decision. He needed to understand this, needed more time with that spark of light that was Lily. Lily thought for a long moment, her small face contorted in deliberation. Hunger was probably a constant companion, but pride and responsibility were stronger. "I can't leave my grandmother alone," she said finally, her voice firm. "She needs me, and she needs to eat too." Her plea was not a plea for pity, but a statement of fact. Her priority was clear. That small act of unwavering loyalty had impressed Ethan deeply. Most children her age would be thinking about toys or candy, but Lily was thinking about taking care of her family. Ethan felt a lump in his throat. "Okay," he said, his voice softer than usual. "How about this? We buy lunch and you take some to your grandmother. And then, if you'll let me, I'd like to take you both to see a doctor." The offer of help was genuine, devoid of any hidden agenda, perhaps for the first time in his adult life. Lily hesitated, but the mention of taking food to her grandmother seemed to convince her. She nodded, barely perceptible. The journey to a nearby restaurant was surreal for Ethan. Accustomed to sanitized environments and businesslike conversations, he walked down the sidewalk with his son on one side and a barefoot girl on the other. People watched, judging the scene with curious and disapproving glances. For once, Ethan didn't care. He was focused on the interaction between the two children. They talked nonstop with their hands, a stream of stories and silent questions. Ethan bought sandwiches and juice, and watched Lily carefully pack most of the food into a battered plastic bag. She ate her share slowly, with a decency that belied her obvious hunger. The girl's dignity was a fortress. When they were done, Lily said she had to go. "Can I walk you?" Ethan asked. "I promise. It's just to make sure you're okay." He'd expected her to refuse, but to his surprise, she agreed. Maybe she saw something in his eyes. A change, a sincerity that hadn't been there before. The walk took them away from the tree-lined streets and designer shops, into a part of the city that Ethan had only seen through the armored window of his car. The air grew heavier, the buildings more decrepit. They stopped in front of an old tenement building, its paint peeling and a musty, desolate smell emanating from the door. "This is it," Lily said quietly, apologetically. Ethan's heart sank. The reality he was about to face was far harsher than he could have ever imagined. Climbing the creaky stairs of that tenement was like descending into the basement of the society that Ethan had always ignored. The dim light of the hallways barely illuminated the filth and neglect. Each closed door seemed to hide a story of struggle and despair. Lily led them with sad familiarity to an apartment at the end of the hallway. The door was ajar. Upon entering, Ethan's shock was immediate and visceral. The place was not an apartment. It was a room. A cramped, unsanitary room, where a single bed, a small electric stove, and a pile of blankets fought for the little space available. The smell of disease and poverty was suffocating, and yet, amid the misery, there was a surprising order. Lily's clothes were folded in a cardboard box. The few dishes were clean and stacked. It was the dignity of poverty, a Herculean effort to maintain humanity in an environment that tried to steal it at every second. On the bed, huddled under a thin blanket, was an elderly woman. Her hair was white and thin, and her skin, paper thin, was stretched tight over her bones. Her eyes, however, lit up for a moment when she saw Lily. "My angel," she whispered, her voice as fragile as a dry leaf. "You're back." Lily rushed to her side, handing her the food with a smile. "I brought lunch, Grandma," she said. The scene was both touching and heartbreaking. A child with an emotional maturity forged in the fires of adversity, caring for her grandmother with a tenderness that many adults would never know. Noah, beside his father, watched in silence, his wide eyes absorbing the sadness and love in that small room. Ethan felt like a clumsy giant, an invader from another world. All his money, all his success, seemed obscene and useless in the face of this display of love and survival. Ethan introduced himself to Lily's grandmother, Catherine. Her mind seemed to fluctuate between lucidity and confusion. One moment she spoke of Lily as her savior, and the next she seemed lost in memories of a distant past. It was in one of these moments of clarity that she looked at Ethan, her hooded eyes focusing on him for the first time. You look familiar," she said, her voice gaining an unexpected strength. "You work in investment banking, don't you? At that big firm, Blackwell Capital." Ethan was taken aback. "Yes, that's me," he said, confused as to how she could possibly know that. Catherine smiled a sad smile, a shadow of recognition crossing her tired face. "My daughter, my Sophie. She worked for you. She was so proud of that job." The mention of the name of the firm and his daughter struck Ethan like a bolt of lightning. Lily's mother's name was Sophie. Sophie Davis. The name rang in Ethan's mind, echoing in some forgotten corridor of his corporate memory. He signed dozens of documents every day, contracts, reports, resignations. They were just names on a piece of paper. But Sophie Davis, there was something there. Catherine continued, her voice now a whimper. "She was the best interpreter you had. She loved what she did. And then, they fired her. They said she leaked information. A lie. My Sophie would never do that. A manager. He was harassing her. When she rejected him, he made up that story to get rid of her." Each word was a shovelful of dirt being thrown over the coffin of Ethan's ignorance. He remembered it now. A report from a mid-level manager, Edward Monroe, accusing an interpreter of breach of confidentiality. A summary dismissal to set an example. Ethan felt the breath leave his lungs. He remembered the document on his desk, the name Sophie Davis, printed in bold letters, and beneath it, his own signature, elegant and carefree, sealing the fate of a woman he had never met. He had not investigated. He had not questioned. He had trusted the manager, a man he now remembered as a slippery and ambitious individual. He had destroyed the life of an innocent employee with a simple flourish of his pen. The loss of his job, Catherine explained, was the beginning of the end. With no income, they had been evicted. Sophie's health, already fragile, deteriorated rapidly under the stress and humiliation. The woman who could have been the bridge to his own son's world, a communications specialist working under his corporate roof, had been crushed by the machine he himself commanded. The weight of that injustice fell on Ethan with crushing force, shattering what was left of his armor. The regret that flooded Ethan was not just a feeling, it was a physical ache, a burning in his chest. He glanced at Lily, who was now wiping her grandmother's face with a damp cloth, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her visitor. This girl, with her strength and kindness, was the direct product of his neglect. He was not just a spectator to their tragedy, he was its architect. The silence in the room was heavy, filled only with Catherine's frail breathing and the distant hum of the city. Ethan, the man who always had an answer, a solution, was completely at a loss for words. What could he say? "I'm sorry I destroyed your family through administrative laziness." The futility of any apology was overwhelming. He glanced at Noah, who was watching the scene with an understanding that seemed beyond his years. Perhaps in this world of silence, emotions were clearer, easier to read, and the emotion on his father's face was undeniably that of a broken man. Driven by a mixture of guilt, shame, and a growing protective affection for Lily, Ethan sprang into action. He left the tenement with a promise to return, a promise he intended to keep with every fiber of his being. His first call was not to one of his aides, but to his personal physician, arranging an emergency home visit for Catherine. Next, he contacted a catering service to ensure that nutritious meals were delivered daily to the tenement. These were a wealthy man's solutions, superficial solutions, but they were a start. They were his way of trying to staunch the bleeding he had caused. As he made the arrangements, he couldn't get the image of Lily caring for her grandmother out of his mind. He saw in her the same resilience, the same kindness that Catherine had said Sophie possessed. He was looking at the living legacy of a woman he had condemned. Over the next few days, Ethan became a constant, if unobtrusive, presence in Lily and Catherine's lives. He brought Noah with him, and their worlds began to merge in a strange and wonderful way. While the doctors tended to Catherine, adjusting her medications and providing comfort she hadn't known in years, Lily and Noah explored their own universe. They spent hours in the park, under the same ancient tree, building a bond that grew stronger with each passing day. Ethan watched from afar, learning more about his son in those weeks than he had in 7 years. He saw Noah express fear, joy, curiosity, and even tell jokes in ASL. Lily was the key that had unlocked a part of his son that Ethan hadn't even known existed. And as he witnessed it, Ethan began to change. The coldness in his eyes was slowly replaced by a hesitant warmth. But life has a cruel way of reminding him that good intentions aren't always enough. Ethan found this out the hard way. He arrived at the tenement one afternoon with shopping bags and a plan to discuss more dignified housing options, only to find his bedroom door open and empty. A neighbor, a kind-looking elderly woman named Mrs. Hope, approached him with a sad expression on her face. "Social services came," she said, her voice low. "Someone called them weeks ago. They said a child can't live like this, taking care of a sick old woman. They took little Lily by force." The ground seemed to disappear beneath Ethan's feet. He stared at Mrs. Hope in disbelief. "And Catherine? Grandma?" The woman shook her head. "An ambulance took her to a public hospital. They said she needs full-time care." The panic Ethan had felt in the park was a mere shadow of the desperation that engulfed him now. He ran to his car, Noah in tow, and began making calls. He called his battalion of lawyers, social services, anyone who would listen. And with each call, he hit the same cold, impersonal brick wall. Bureaucracy. "You are not related to the minor," a faceless voice said on the other end of the line. "We cannot provide any information about her whereabouts. Ms. Davis is a ward of the state. Visitation is restricted to immediate family." His wealth, his connections, his power, none of it mattered. To the system, he was an outsider, a nobody. The irony was brutal. He, who had signed the order that had destroyed Lily's family, now had no legal right to try to fix what had broken it. He was completely powerless. Ethan's frustration quickly turned to icy fury. He was not a man used to hearing no. He instructed his lawyers to do the impossible, to find a loophole, anything. In the meantime, he had to deal with his son's silent grief. Noah didn't understand where Lily had gone. He kept signing her name over and over, his eyes filled with a confusion that broke Ethan's heart. "Lily. Where? Friend. Where?" Ethan tried to explain, his gestures clumsy and inadequate to convey the cruel complexity of the situation. How to explain to a 7-year-old boy about social services, state custody, and the coldness of the law? For the first time, Ethan felt the pain of the communication barrier, not as frustration, but as a moral failure on his part. He had to be better, for Noah, and for Lily. The decision crystallized in his mind over a long, sleepless night in the oppressive silence of his apartment. If the law said he was nothing to Lily, he would become something. He would become everything. The next morning, he summoned his lawyers and gave them an order that left them speechless. "I want to start custody proceedings, and then adoption. I want Lily to be my daughter." The lead lawyer, a man accustomed to the whims of the wealthy, blinked several times. "Mr. Blackwell, this is extremely complicated. You are a single man, unrelated. The system gives preference to couples, to relatives. This is going to be a long and difficult battle." Ethan glared at him, an intensity he usually reserved for hostile negotiations. "I didn't ask if it was easy. I said get started." That was the moment when Ethan Blackwell, the CEO, began to give way to Ethan Blackwell, the father. The legal battle was exactly as the lawyer had predicted, a morass of bureaucracy and resistance. But the biggest obstacle came not from the state, but from within his own company. Edward Monroe, the manager who had engineered Sophie Davis's dismissal, and who, ironically, had been promoted to partner, called an emergency meeting. In the sterile conference room, with the board present via video conference, Monroe laid out his concerns with venomous politeness. "Ethan, we all admire your charity," he began, the word charity said with a hint of disdain. "But adopting a street child? Have you considered the impact that will have on our company's image? Our clients are conservative. They invest in stability, in strength. Associating our brand with that could be detrimental to business. The old Ethan would have agreed. He would have weighed the pros and cons in a mental spreadsheet, calculated the financial risk, and probably backed away. But the man sitting at the head of the table was different. He listened to Monroe finish his speech with eerie calm. Then he leaned forward, his eyes locked on Monroe's, his voice low and dangerous. "Edward, the image of this company will be defined by our actions, not our appearances. And if any client has a problem with an act of human decency, then I will personally be happy to walk them out the door. As for stability, it starts with integrity, something that seems to be lacking in some corners of this company." Then he turned to the board. "By the way, I have reopened an internal investigation into the termination of an employee named Sophie Davis. I am certain the results will be illuminating." Monroe's face went pale. The war was no longer just for Lily's sake, it was for the soul of Ethan's company. As the corporate battle raged, the search for Lily continued. The system had swallowed her up, moving her to a generic shelter somewhere in the sprawling metropolis. Ethan couldn't visit her, couldn't call her, couldn't even send her a gift. He was a ghost in the life of the girl he wanted to save. Frustration ate at him, but he channeled that energy into the fight, hiring private investigators and pressing every legal avenue he could. The weeks dragged on, turning into a month, then two. Ethan's apartment, once a sanctuary of silence, was now a command center, filled with lawyers, paperwork, and the constant presence of Lily's absence. The only thing keeping him going was the gaze of his son, who seemed to have placed an unshakable faith that his father would bring his friend back. And then the news he had feared most came. A call in the middle of the night from the social worker assigned to the case, a woman named Patricia, whose voice was usually monotone and bureaucratic but now held a hint of alarm. "Mr. Blackwell, I'm calling as a courtesy, since you've started the guardianship process. Lily has run away from the shelter." Ethan's heart sank. A small girl, alone, on the streets of New York. The city that had once been his playground of power now felt like a ravenous monster about to devour the most precious thing he had ever found. The police had been notified. Alerts had been issued. But Ethan knew it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. The despair returned with a vengeance, but this time, there was a difference. He was not alone in his panic. Noah, who was in the living room playing with blocks, felt the change in the atmosphere. He saw his father's face, the anguish in his eyes. He walked over and tugged on Ethan's sleeve. "Dad, what's wrong?" Ethan knelt down, phone still in hand, and tried to explain in the simplest of signs he could muster. "Lily, gone. Lost." Noah's expression went from confusion to intense concentration. He was quiet for a moment, his eyes darting back and forth as if he were accessing a mental map no one else could see. The adults in the room, Ethan, his lawyers, the investigators, were thinking about bus stations, homeless shelters, the logical places. But Noah wasn't thinking with adult logic. He was thinking with the heart of a child. Suddenly, Noah's eyes widened in understanding. He began to gesture rapidly, with an urgency Ethan had never seen in him. His fingers formed the signs: tree, big park, Lily, Noah, home. The message was so simple, so obvious, that none of the adults had thought of it. The place where it all began, their sanctuary, the symbolic home they had created beneath the branches of that ancient tree. Ethan looked at his son, a sense of pride and admiration flooding through him. In that moment, the barrier between them disappeared completely. This was not a father trying to understand a son with a disability. This was a father being guided by his son's wisdom. "You're right," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're absolutely right." He picked Noah up, kissed his forehead, and ran for the door. The park was dark and silent, the hustle and bustle of the day replaced by the eerie stillness of night. Ethan ran, Noah holding his hand tightly. They walked past the empty swings, past the lonely slide, until they reached the clearing where the large tree stood. And there, huddled at the base of the trunk, a small figure shivering with cold and fear, was Lily. She looked up at the sound of their footsteps, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She looked smaller, more fragile than Ethan remembered. When she saw them, a mixture of relief and shame crossed her face. She curled up even tighter, as if she wanted to be swallowed by the earth. Ethan slowed his pace, approaching her carefully so as not to frighten her. His heart ached to see her so broken. "I failed," Lily whispered, as Ethan crouched down in front of her. "I promised my mother I would take care of Grandma, and I failed. They took me. They took her. I am a terrible daughter." The words came out in a sob, weighed down with a guilt no child should have to carry. Ethan, a man of few words and even fewer emotions, felt tears welling up in his own eyes. He didn't know what to say. The apologies seemed hollow, the promises fragile. He wanted to hug her, but he feared the gesture would be too invasive. It was Noah who broke the deadlock. He let go of his father's hand, walked over to Lily, and simply sat down beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't make any grand gestures. He just stood there, a silent, supportive presence. Then, after a long moment, Noah reached out his small hand and touched Lily's arm. When she looked up at him, he made a single, slow, deliberate sign. Home. And then he pointed at himself, Lily, and Ethan. Home. It wasn't a place. It was a concept. It was them. Together. That simple, yet immensely powerful gesture was the only thing that could have reached Lily in her spiral of despair. She looked from Noah to Ethan, and for the first time she allowed herself to see the sincerity in the rich, complicated man's eyes. She burst into tears, not of sadness, but of cathartic relief. And this time, when Ethan reached out, she didn't flinch. He hugged her, along with Noah, and the three of them stood there, under the protection of the ancient tree, a broken, makeshift family beginning to heal. Returning to the system after finding Lily was a calculated risk. Ethan knew he could lose her again, but now he had a plan, allies, and most importantly, a cause to fight for. He contacted Patricia, the social worker, and explained what had happened. Instead of bureaucratic coldness, he found a voice of genuine concern on the other end of the line. Patricia agreed to meet them in court the next morning for an emergency hearing. Ethan spent the night awake, not with worry, but with preparation. He and his lawyers gathered everything they had, but Ethan knew the case would not be won with legal arguments, but with testimony from the heart. He made two important calls, one to Mrs. Hope, Lily's neighbor, and another to the park caretaker, Mrs. Celia, a woman who always watched the children with a watchful and caring eye. The courtroom was cold and intimidating, a place designed to crush the human spirit with the weight of the law. The judge looked weary and skeptical. On the other side, a lawyer for the state argued that Lily should be kept in a safer haven, away from an influential stranger with questionable motives. The situation looked grim. But then Ethan's first witness was called. Mrs. Hope, with her cane and floral dress, took the stand. In a shaky but steady voice, she described Sophie's devotion to her daughter, their struggle after her unfair dismissal, and most of all, Lily's love and care for her grandmother. "That little girl is not a burden," she said, looking directly at the judge. "She is a miracle. She held that family together with sheer willpower." Next to testify was Mrs. Celia, the park caretaker. She told how she had watched for months as Noah and Lily's friendship blossomed beneath the ancient tree. "I see so many children in this park," she said, her voice ringing with the authority of someone who sees everything. "I see children who have all the toys in the world, but who seem empty. And I saw those too. They had nothing, but they had everything. I had never seen the boy, Noah, smile like that before I met Lily. She didn't just give him friendship, Your Honor. She gave him a voice." Her testimony painted a picture not of charity, but of mutuality. This was not a rich man saving a poor girl. This was two children saving each other, and in the process, saving the man as well. The social worker, Patricia, was next. She admitted that the system failed Lily. "Our protocols are designed to protect children from harm, but sometimes they blind us to the good," she said. "I have visited Mr. Blackwell. I have seen how he transformed his world to prepare for Lily. I have seen how Noah has blossomed, and I have seen the records of Sophie Davis's termination. The system made a mistake, but the bigger mistake was what Mr. Blackwell's company did years ago. He is not trying to buy a child, Your Honor. He is trying to right a terrible wrong the only way he knows how." Her support, coming from within the system, was a powerful blow to the state's argument. But the moment that silenced the courtroom came from where it was least expected. Ethan's attorney, in a bold move, asked the judge to hear one more person, Noah Blackwell. The state attorney protested, "The boy is deaf. How can he testify?" The judge, however, intrigued, allowed it. An interpreter was called. Noah, small and serious in his suit, walked to the front of the room. He did not look at the judge. He looked at Lily, and then he began to sign. His hands moved with a clarity and passion that filled the silence. The interpreter, her voice breaking, began to translate. Before Lily, my world was quiet. The interpreter translated, her voice shaking. My father gave me many things. Toys, lessons. But I didn't have a friend. I didn't have colors. Lily has colors. She taught me to laugh without sound. She taught me that family isn't about listening. It's about understanding. Noah paused, took a deep breath, and looked at the judge for the first time, his eyes shining with fierce determination. She's not my friend, he continued, his frown growing stronger. She's my sister. The sister my heart has always wanted. My father, me, and Lily. We are family. Please, don't break our family again. A collective sob went up in the room. There wasn't a dry eye. The legal argument had been obliterated by raw emotional truth. The judge, a man who had seen it all, took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He looked at Ethan, at Lily, who was crying silently, and at Noah, who stood proudly. After a long silence that seemed to last a lifetime, he banged his gavel. Provisional custody granted to Mr. Ethan Blackwell, he announced, his voice hoarse with emotion. We will reevaluate for permanent adoption in 6 months. But from what I've seen here today, I think the outcome will be a mere formality. Case dismissed. The room erupted in a sigh of relief. Ethan ran over and hugged both children, a hug that was no longer awkward or calculated, but rather the embrace of a father protecting his flock, his heart finally whole. The months that followed were a symphony of transformation. Ethan's once cold and silent mansion filled with life. The echoes of the empty hallways were replaced by laughter, the sound of running feet, and most of all, the visual language of the family they were building. ASL charts were placed on the walls alongside expensive artwork. Children's books were piled high on designer coffee tables. The smell of cookies baking in the oven often overshadowed the leather smell of the furniture. Ethan discovered the joy of simple things. Reading a bedtime story and sighing to 2 children snuggled in his arms, having tickle fights on the Persian rug, and having dinner parties where communication flowed freely in a mix of voice and gesture. The change in Ethan was profound and visible to all. At work, he was no longer the cold, calculating shark. He became a visionary leader. His first major initiative was the creation of Project Sophie. It wasn't a charity event, but a fundamental restructuring of the company's culture. The project created an entire department dedicated to inclusion, with aggressive hiring goals for people with hearing and other disabilities, providing interpreters for all major meetings, and creating mentoring programs. He also established a relief fund for current and former employees who were struggling, a safety net that Sophie Davis never had. Edward Monroe, the partner who had opposed all of this, was fired after the internal investigation concluded that he was guilty of Sophie's case. His departure marked the end of an era at Blackwell Capital. The firm's new culture, focused on social responsibility and empathy, attracted a new breed of talent and clients. The change, which Monroe feared would be a financial disaster, ended up being the firm's greatest asset. The story of Ethan, Lily, and Noah leaked to the press, not as a scandal but as an inspiring story of redemption. Blackwell Capital became a model of how success and humanity could go hand in hand. The internal opposition that had existed simply dissolved in the face of the moral strength of the new leadership. Away from the corporate world, Ethan's family continued to flourish. Lily, with access to proper nutrition, education, and most importantly, emotional security, blossomed. The cautious, serious girl gave way to a vibrant, curious child. Though her innate wisdom and empathy remained, she excelled in school, becoming a fierce advocate for other children and teaching ASL to her classmates. Her friendship with Noah was the anchor of their lives, an unbreakable bond forged in shared solitude and cemented in brotherly love. They had their own secret language, their own jokes, a private world that Ethan felt privileged to be able to witness. Ethan also made sure that Catherine received the best possible care. He moved her to a top-notch nursing home with dementia specialists. In his lucid moments, he visited her with Lily and Noah. During those visits, Catherine would look at her healthy, happy granddaughter and the man who had somehow become her family, and a peaceful smile would light up her face. She didn't remember every detail of the injustice she had suffered, but she could see the aftermath. Her granddaughter was safe, loved, and that was all that mattered. Ethan, in turn, never tired of apologizing to her, not with words but with his actions. ensuring that the rest of her days would be filled with dignity and comfort. The day Lily's adoption became official was a quiet and profound celebration. There was no big party, just the three of them, in the same courtroom where their battle had been won. When the judge signed the final decree and declared Lily Ann Blackwell Ethan's legitimate daughter, the world seemed to shift back on its axis. Lily, who once had nothing, now had a name, a home, and a family. Ethan, who once had everything but felt empty, now had a purpose and a heart overflowing with love. And Noah, who had lived in a world of silence, now found his life filled with the most beautiful melody of all, that of human connection. Ethan's journey from distant CEO to loving father was a complete transformation. He learned to communicate not just with his hands, but with his heart. He learned that true strength lies not in controlling the world around you, but in allowing yourself to be vulnerable and connect with others. He discovered that the greatest wealth was not in his bank statements, but in the moments he watched his two children laugh together, sharing a silent secret under the watchful eye of a father who had finally found his way home. The luxury he now treasured was not the one in his apartment overlooking the park, but the one in being able to look out the window at the park with his two children by his side, knowing they were safe, happy, and together. Noah's transformation was equally remarkable, a flower finally receiving the sunlight it needed to fully blossom. With Lily by his side, he became more confident and expressive. The hesitation that had once marked his gestures gave way to an eloquence and self-assurance that astonished his therapists and teachers. He was no longer just the deaf boy, but Noah, a smart, funny, and incredibly perceptive boy. His ability to read people's emotions, honed by a lifetime of observing the world without the filter of sound, became one of his greatest gifts. He was the family's emotional compass, often sensing Ethan or Lily's needs before they even recognized them themselves, communicating his support with a simple touch on the arm or an encouraging nod. For Lily, adjusting to a life of stability and abundance was a gradual process. At first, she instinctively hoarded food, as if she feared it might all disappear at any moment. She marveled at things that Ethan and Noah took for granted, like a refrigerator that was always full, or having more than one pair of shoes. But what struck her most was security. The knowledge that she would have a warm bed to sleep in, that she wouldn't have to worry about her grandmother's next meal, that she was no longer alone in the world. This security allowed the child within her, long suppressed by responsibility, to finally emerge. She learned to play without worry, to be loud and messy, to simply be a child. And Ethan celebrated each of these moments as a victory. The dynamic between the three of them settled into a beautiful and unique rhythm. Mornings began not with the sound of an alarm clock, but with Noah and Lily jumping on Ethan's bed, engaging in lively conversation in ASL about their dreams or plans for the day. Dinners were sacred affairs, where the rule was no phones, just family. They shared the day's triumphs and challenges, with Ethan patiently translating when needed, but increasingly fluent in the language that was now the official language of their home. The home, once a space of solitude, became a sanctuary of communication, proving that the deepest dialogue often transcends spoken words. The impact of Project Sophie reverberated far beyond the walls of Blackwell Capital. Other companies, inspired by the story and success of the initiative, began to reevaluate their own inclusion policies. Ethan became a reluctant but powerful advocate for corporate social responsibility, giving speeches and sharing his personal journey. He never portrayed himself as a hero. Instead, he always began his story by confessing his failure, by signing the paper that nearly destroyed Sophie Davis's life. His honesty and humility made him an authentic and respected voice in the fight for a more conscious and humane capitalism. He was, in effect, redressing injustice on a scale he never imagined possible. One touching detail of this new phase was the way they kept Sophie's memory alive. Ethan had a photograph of her framed, a picture he found in the company's old archives. In the photo, Sophie was smiling, performing at an event, her hands in full motion. He placed the portrait in the living room. Lily cried when she saw it, but they were tears of gratitude. Every night before bed, she and Noah would stand in front of the photo and sign to her to tell her about their day. It was a silent and sacred ritual, a way to honor the woman whose tragic absence had somehow brought them all together. It was a way to say that her legacy of love and communication had not been forgotten. Over time, Ethan also learned to forgive himself. It was a long process, helped by quiet conversations with his children and visits with Catherine. He understood that he could not change the past, but he could honor it by building a better future. The weight of guilt was gradually replaced by a lightness of purpose. He was no longer haunted by the ghost of his neglect, but instead inspired by Sophie's spirit, Lily's resilience, and Noah's quiet wisdom. He found redemption not in a grand act of absolution, but in the small, everyday gestures, helping Lily with her homework, watching a movie with Noah, or simply sitting quietly with them, feeling the peace of belonging. Ethan's relationship with the outside world changed too. His former friends from his elite social circle no longer recognized him. He traded in his dinner parties and charity performances for picnics in the park and afternoons volunteering at a local shelter where Lily insisted on helping out. He sold his flashy Manhattan apartment and bought a spacious house in the suburbs with a big backyard for the kids to play in. The house was less impressive, but infinitely more welcoming. He had traded a life of appearances for a life of substance, and he had never felt richer. There was one particularly poignant moment, about a year after the adoption, when Noah came home from school with a prize from an art competition. It was a charcoal drawing of the tree in the park, but the drawing didn't just show the tree. It showed three figures beneath it: a tall man, a little girl, and a little boy, all holding hands. The lines were simple, childlike, but the emotion that emanated from the image was incredibly powerful. Below the drawing, Noah had written in slightly shaky handwriting, "Our family started here." Ethan framed the drawing and hung it next to Sophie's photograph. The two paintings, side by side, told the whole story. A story of loss, of finding, of repair, and of love. Lily, for her part, found her own way to give back. Using the fluency in ASL that her mother had given her, she started a small club at school to teach sign language to other children. Her motivation was simple and profound. No one should feel alone just because they can't hear with their ears, she explained to Ethan. The club became a success, building bridges of communication and empathy between hearing and hard-of-hearing children. The girl who had once been invisible to society was now actively making the world a more inclusive place, a perfect echo of her mother's legacy and her father's new mission. Catherine's health, though still fragile, stabilized with proper care. Her moments of lucidity became a little more frequent. On one of those clear days, while holding Lily's hand during a visit, she looked at Ethan and said something he would remember forever. "Sophie always believed in angels. I think she sent you, not to save her, but so she could save you." In that moment, Ethan understood. He thought he was saving Lily, but the truth was that Lily, Noah, and Sophie's spirit had rescued him from a life of golden emptiness, teaching him the true meaning of being rich. The new family dynamic also had an unexpected and positive effect on Ethan's professional life. His ability to listen, not just with his ears, but with attention and empathy, made him a much more effective negotiator and leader. He learned to read the unspoken nuances, to understand the underlying motivations of his colleagues and clients. The sadam patience he developed while learning ASL and navigating the challenges of fatherhood translated into a more thoughtful and strategic approach to business. The company became not only more ethical, but also more innovative and profitable, proving that humanity was not a liability, but the greatest asset. Ethan and Noah's relationship reached a depth that had previously seemed unattainable. They developed their own inside jokes and sign, their own ways of expressing affection and frustration. Ethan learned to appreciate silence not as an absence, but as a space for deeper communication. He became fluent in ASL, not out of obligation, but out of love. He reveled in being able to discuss politics, science, or simply the latest school gossip with his son, in a language that was entirely theirs. The chasm that had once separated them was now a bridge built with patience, respect, and a rediscovered love. Lily, in keeping with her nurturing nature, became Noah's fierce protector at school and the guardian of harmony at home. If Ethan seemed stressed after a long day at work, it was Lily who would signal Noah, and the two would approach him for a group sandwich hug. If Noah was frustrated about something, it was Lily who would calm him down, talking to him at his own pace, with an understanding that only they shared. She was the heart of the family, the link that connected Ethan's pragmatism and Noah's sensitivity, creating a perfect balance. Their story, though private at its core, became something of an inspiring urban legend in the city. People in the park would occasionally recognize them and wave with a knowing smile. Mrs. Hope and Mrs. Celia became honorary aunts to the family, often invited to dinners and celebrations. The community that formed around them was proof that kindness is contagious. Lily's initial act of sharing her language with a lonely boy sparked a wave of empathy that touched countless lives, far beyond what either of them could have anticipated. Even the relationship with Edward Monroe had an unexpected ending. Months after his dismissal, Ethan received a letter from him. It was an apology. Monroe wrote that after losing everything, he was forced to reevaluate his life and his choices. He admitted his mistake in Sophie's affair and expressed deep regret. He didn't ask for forgiveness, just to let Ethan know that the change he had initiated at the company had forced him to confront his own demons. Ethan read the letter and, instead of satisfaction, felt a pang of compassion. He responded with a single sentence: "It's never too late to find your way back." The celebration of Lily's first adoption anniversary was a milestone. Ethan took them on a trip to Disneyland. Seeing Lily and Noah's eyes light up with the magic of the place, excitedly communicating about each character and attraction, was the greatest return on any investment Ethan had ever made. On that trip, he realized that his family was not broken or makeshift. They were simply a family, with their own unique story and their own love language. They were whole, complete, and stronger because of the scars they shared. The suburban mansion, now filled with photos and drawings and the happy disarray of family life, was a living testament to his journey. Ethan's expensive suit that had been crumpled in the park on the day of the panic was now tucked away in the back of the closet, a relic of a past life. He had replaced it with comfortable jeans and sweaters, the clothes of a man who no longer needed armor to face the world. He was simply Ethan, father to Noah and Lily, a title he now wore with more pride than CEO. On a crisp autumn afternoon, with the leaves falling in shades of gold and red, the final scene of this story unfolds. Ethan, Noah, and Lily return to the park, to the place where it all began. They don't go there for any special reason, just because it's their place. The ancient tree stands there, majestic and unchanging, its leaves dancing in the breeze. They spread a towel on the grass, the same grass where Ethan found the two children in a conversation that would change their lives forever. The air is cool, and the afternoon sun casts long shadows on the ground. Lily, now 9, is teaching Ethan a complicated new sign, laughing at his clumsy fingers. Noah lies on his back, staring at the clouds, and suddenly, he's gesturing a story about a dragon he sees forming in the sky. Lily and Ethan join in the fantasy, adding details to the silent story. There's no more panic in Ethan's eyes, only a deep, abiding peace. There's no more loneliness in Noah's eyes, only the joy of companionship. And there's no more fear or crushing responsibility in Lily's eyes, only the trust and glow of a loved child. Ethan watches his two children, their hearts beating in unison with his. He looks up at the ancient tree, the silent witness to his fall and his redemption. Once the symbol of his greatest fear, it is now the monument to his greatest joy. He holds out his arms, and Lily and Noah nestle into it. Together, the three of them gaze up at the branches that stretch toward the sky, a tangle of strength and resilience, just like them. The silence between them is not empty. It is filled with love, gratitude, and the promise of countless tomorrows. The Blackwell family, rebuilt from the ashes of injustice and cemented by empathy, has found its happy ending, not in a fairy tale, but in the heartbreaking, imperfect reality of unconditional love.